February 1945. A small volcanic island rises from the Pacific Ocean, barely 8 square miles of black sand and volcanic rock. To most of the world, it was an insignificant speck in the vast expanse of the Pacific. But to the American military planners and Japanese defenders, Iwo Jima was worth dying for. This barren island, whose name means Sulphur Island in Japanese, would become the site of one of the bloodiest battles in United States Marine Corps history. For 36 days, American Marines would fight yard by yard, cave by cave, against an enemy who had vowed never to surrender. The Japanese defenders, entrenched in an elaborate network of tunnels and fortifications, would fight with a fanaticism that shocked even hardened combat veterans. The battle would produce more medals of honor, 27, than any other single engagement in American military history. It would claim nearly 7,000 American lives and all but 216 of the 21,000 Japanese defenders. And it would give the world one of the most iconic images in history. 6 Marines raising the American flag atop Mount Suribachi. But behind that famous photograph lies a story of unimaginable courage, brutal combat, and sacrifice on a scale that defies comprehension. This is the story of young men, most barely out of their teens, who stormed ashore on black volcanic beaches under withering fire. This is the story of defenders who transformed an island into a fortress and fought to the death rather than surrender. This is the story of Iwo Jima, where hell had an address and courage had a name. So let us enter this sulfurous hell of Iwo Jima and witness why this tiny island became one of the most legendary battles in military history. By early 1945, the tide of war in the Pacific had turned decisively against Japan. American forces had island-hopped across the Pacific, capturing key bases in the Philippines, the Marianas, and the Caroline Islands. B-29 Superfortress bombers operating from bases in the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were conducting strategic bombing raids against the Japanese home islands. But there was a problem. The 1,500-mile distance from the Marianas to Tokyo meant that B-29s flew at the extreme limit of their range. Damaged bombers often couldn't make it back, ditching in the ocean with their crews. Fighter escorts were impossible. No American fighter had the range to accompany the bombers to Japan and back. And there, directly on the flight path between the Marianas and Tokyo, sat Iwo Jima. The Japanese had constructed 2 operational airfields on the island, with a third under construction. Japanese fighters based on Iwo Jima intercepted American bombers on their way to Japan. Japanese radar stations on the island provided early warning of incoming raids. And Japanese bombers from Iwo Jima conducted nuisance raids on American bases in the Marianas. The strategic calculus was clear. Iwo Jima in American hands would solve multiple problems. It would eliminate the Japanese fighter and early warning threat. It would provide an emergency landing field for damaged B-29s returning from Japan. And critically, it would serve as a base for P-51 Mustang fighters to escort the bombers all the way to Tokyo and back. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, and General Curtis LeMay, commanding the strategic bombing campaign, both pressed for the capture of Iwo Jima. The invasion, codenamed Operation Detachment, was scheduled for February 1945. The assault would be carried out by the 5th Amphibious Corps, consisting of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, a total of approximately 70,000 Marines. It would be the largest Marine Corps operation in the Pacific War. Intelligence estimates predicted the battle would last 5 days. The Marines would capture Iwo Jima, secure the airfields, and continue the drive toward Japan. It seemed straightforward enough. Another island assault in a long series of island assaults that had brought American forces closer and closer to the Japanese homeland. But Iwo Jima would prove to be different. The Japanese defenders, under the command of Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, were not a typical Japanese general. A cavalry officer who had served as a military attaché in the United States and Canada during the 1920s, Kuribayashi understood American industrial might and military capability better than most of his peers. He harbored no illusions about Japan's ability to win the war. When Kuribayashi arrived on Iwo Jima in June 1944, he faced a daunting task. The island was small, just 4.5 miles long and 2.5 miles at its widest point. It had no natural water source. Supplies had to be brought in by sea, and American submarines made that increasingly dangerous. The garrison had been reinforced to over 21,000 men, but Kuribayashi knew that if the Americans wanted Iwo Jima, they would come with overwhelming force. Traditional Japanese defensive doctrine called for meeting the enemy at the water's edge, defending the beaches with all available firepower, and destroying the invasion force as it attempted to land. This strategy had failed catastrophically at Saipan, Guam, and other islands. Kuribayashi decided on a radically different approach. He would not defend the beaches. Instead, he would allow the Americans to land unopposed and then slaughter them from concealed positions once they were ashore. He would not waste lives in suicide banzai charges. Instead, his men would fight from fortified positions, inflicting maximum casualties while preserving their own forces as long as possible. He would not die quickly. Instead, he would make the Americans pay in blood for every yard of volcanic rock. Kuribayashi issued explicit orders to his men: no banzai charges, no wasteful suicide attacks. Every man would sell his life as dearly as possible, taking at least 10 Americans with him. The defense of Iwo Jima would not be a quick, glorious death for the emperor. It would be a slow, grinding battle of attrition designed to make the Americans pay such a high price that they would reconsider their planned invasion of Japan itself. In his letters home, Kuribayashi was grimly realistic. He told his family he did not expect to survive. He knew the Americans would eventually take Iwo Jima, but he intended to make them pay such a terrible price that his death and the deaths of his men would serve Japan's ultimate interests. The Americans had no idea what would await them on the black volcanic beaches of Iwo Jima. The American pre-invasion bombardment of Iwo Jima began on December 8, 1944, nearly 2.5 months before the scheduled invasion date. B-24 Liberator and B-29 Super Fortress bombers from the Marianas struck the island repeatedly, dropping thousands of tons of bombs on suspected Japanese positions. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, cruisers and destroyers of the U.S. Navy joined the bombardment, shelling the island for several hours. These naval bombardments would continue intermittently through January and into February. The final pre-invasion bombardment began on February 16, 1945, 3 days before the scheduled landing. 6 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and numerous destroyers formed up offshore and began a systematic bombardment of the island. For 3 days, American warships poured shells onto Iwo Jima. The battleship's 14-inch and 16-inch guns hurled shells weighing up to 2,700 pounds at Japanese positions. The cruiser's 8-inch guns added their weight to the barrage. Destroyers moved in close to shore to target specific fortifications with their 5-inch guns. Carrier-based aircraft from Task Force 58 added to the destruction, dive bombing and strafing suspected Japanese positions. Pilots reported that the island looked like it had been carpet-bombed. Entire hillsides were cratered. Smoke and dust hung over the island in a permanent pall. Admiral William H.P. Blandy, commanding the bombardment force, requested additional days of bombardment before the invasion. He wanted at least 10 days to thoroughly pulverize the Japanese defenses, but the Navy needed the ships elsewhere, and the timetable for subsequent operations was tight. The request was denied. On the morning of February 19, 1945, D-Day for Iwo Jima, the bombardment reached its crescendo. From before dawn until the first Marines hit the beach at 9 a.m., American guns poured fire onto the landing beaches and the terraces beyond them. The noise was deafening. Smoke and dust hung over the island in a permanent pall. Observers on the ships were confident. Nothing could have survived such a bombardment. The Japanese defenders must be dead, buried, or too stunned to offer effective resistance. The Marines would secure the beaches quickly, then push inland to capture the airfields. But deep in their tunnels and fortified positions, the Japanese defenders waited. The bombardment had destroyed some surface installations and killed some men caught in the open, but the deep bunkers and tunnel systems remained largely intact. Kuribayashi's defensive plan had survived the American bombardment. As the barrage lifted and the first waves of landing craft churned toward the black beaches, Japanese defenders moved into their fighting positions. Artillery crews loaded their guns, machine gunners checked their weapons, officers synchronized watches and reminded their men, "Wait for the signal. Let them come ashore. Let them bunch up on the beaches. Then kill them all." The trap was set. The Marines were about to walk into hell. At 8:59 a.m. on February 19, 1945, the first wave of Marines hit the beaches of Iwo Jima. The landing plan called for the 4th Marine Division to land on the right flank, the eastern beaches designated yellow and blue. The 5th Marine would land on the left flank, the western beaches designated green and red. Once ashore, the 5th would wheel south and capture Mount Suribachi, while the 4th would push north toward the 1st airfield. The 1st Marines to reach the beach found the black volcanic sand nearly impossible to move through. Made of volcanic ash and cinders, the sand offered no footing. Men sank up to their ankles with every step. Tracked vehicles bogged down, equipment was difficult to move, and the terraces, steep slopes of soft sand rising 15 feet from the waterline, created natural obstacles that slowed the advance to a crawl. For the first several minutes, there was no enemy fire. Marines scrambled up the beaches, struggling through the sand, expecting Japanese resistance at any moment, but encountering none. Some allowed themselves to hope that the bombardment had worked, that the Japanese had been obliterated, and the landing would be unopposed. Then, at exactly the moment when the beaches were packed with men and equipment, when landing craft were disgorging more Marines every minute, when the follow-on waves were approaching the shore, the Japanese opened fire. It started with mortar rounds, hundreds of them falling on the beaches in a devastating barrage. Then the artillery joined in, carefully pre-registered fire from guns positioned across the island. Machine guns opened up, their fields of fire interlocking to cover every inch of beach. Anti-tank guns targeted the Sherman tanks and amphibious vehicles trying to climb off the beach. The beaches of Iwo Jima became a killing ground. Marines dove for cover, but there was no cover, just open beach and soft sand. Men were hit by shrapnel from mortars and artillery shells. Machine gun fire cut down Marines as they tried to advance. The wounded screamed for corpsmen, many of whom were hit themselves trying to reach the casualties. Sergeant Robert Leader, a squad leader in the 4th Marine Division, later described the first moments after the Japanese opened fire. It was like a wall of steel and explosives suddenly materialized in front of us. Men were being hit all around me. The noise was indescribable. Shells exploding, machine guns firing, men screaming. I saw a kid next to me just disappear. A shell landed right where he was standing. There was nothing left. Landing craft continued to pour Marines onto the beach, even as the casualties mounted. Boats broached in the surf, were hit by artillery fire, or crashed into the wrecks of other landing craft. The beach became a chaotic tangle of men, equipment, burning vehicles, and bodies. Despite the carnage, the Marines pushed forward. Small units found gaps in the Japanese fire and advanced off the beach. Combat engineers worked under fire to clear paths through the soft sand and up the terraces. Sherman tanks, many of them immobilized in the sand, used their guns to suppress Japanese positions they could identify. By noon, approximately 30,000 Marines had landed on Iwo Jima. Casualties in some units had already reached 30%. The beaches were still under heavy fire, but the Marines had established a fragile foothold on the island, and they were pushing inland despite fierce resistance. General Holland M. Smith, commanding the landing force from aboard the command ship, watched the battle through binoculars and felt his stomach sink. This wasn't going to be a 5-day battle. Looking at the casualties being evacuated back to the ships, seeing the intensity of the Japanese fire, Smith made a grim prediction. This is going to be hell. He had no idea how right he was. The fighting on Iwo Jima quickly settled into a brutal yard-by-yard slog. The Japanese defensive positions were incredibly difficult to spot and nearly impossible to destroy. A machine gun emplacement might be just a small hole in the ground, invisible until it opened fire. Artillery pieces fired from caves, then were pulled back into the mountain before American observers could locate them. The Marines learned that traditional infantry tactics didn't work on Iwo Jima. Flanking maneuvers were impossible. The Japanese had interlocking fields of fire covering every approach. Artillery and naval gunfire support were often ineffective against the deeply buried bunkers. Airstrikes could crater the landscape, but rarely destroyed the underground positions. The Marines developed new tactics born of desperation and necessity. Flamethrowers became the primary weapon for clearing bunkers and cave positions. Combat engineers would blast openings in fortifications with demolition charges. Then flamethrower operators would pour burning gasoline into the positions, roasting the defenders alive or driving them out to be shot. Tank infantry teams proved essential. Sherman tanks would approach a Japanese position, drawing fire and revealing the location. Infantry would then maneuver close enough to use flamethrowers, satchel charges, or grenades. The tanks provided the firepower and protection. The infantry provided the precision and close-quarters killing power. But even with these tactics, progress was measured in yards per day, and the cost in American lives was staggering. Companies that landed with 240 men were reduced to 50 or 60 within days. Casualties among junior officers and NCOs, the men who led from the front, were particularly heavy. Corporal Charles "Chuck" Lindbergh, a squad leader in the 5th Marine Division, described the fighting. You'd think you'd cleared a position and then fire would come from somewhere else. The Japs had these tunnels connecting everything. You'd kill the guys in one bunker, and 5 minutes later more would come up through the tunnels and reoccupy it. We had to go back and clear the same positions 2, 3, 4 times. It was exhausting, terrifying, and it never seemed to end. The terrain itself was as much an enemy as the Japanese. The volcanic rock was sharp enough to shred boots and clothing. The sulfurous volcanic vents released toxic gases that made breathing difficult. There was no natural water. Everything had to be brought in. The volcanic sand got into weapons, causing malfunctions. And there was nowhere to dig in properly. Trying to dig a foxhole in the volcanic ash was like trying to dig in sugar. Casualties mounted at an alarming rate. Within the first 3 days, over 2,000 Marines had been killed and nearly 6,000 wounded.
Hospital ships offshore were overwhelmed. Surgeons worked around the clock performing hundreds of operations. Some wounded had to wait hours for treatment simply because there were too many casualties and not enough doctors. The psychological toll was immense. Men watched their buddies die horrible deaths. The constant bombardment from Japanese mortars and artillery caused shell shock, what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. Some Marines just broke, unable to continue functioning. Others developed what Marines called the 1,000-yard stare, eyes that had seen too much death and could no longer focus on the present. Yet despite the casualties, despite the brutal conditions, despite the apparent futility of attacking positions that seemed invulnerable, the Marines kept pushing forward. They were motivated by duty, by loyalty to their fellow Marines, by anger at seeing their friends killed, and by a stubborn refusal to let the Japanese win. Private First Class Robert Champion, a 19-year-old rifleman, later explained the mindset. You didn't think about the big picture. You didn't think about winning the war or capturing the island. You thought about the guy next to you. You thought about your squad. You thought about getting through the next hour, the next firefight. And you thought about killing the bastards who were trying to kill you.
While the main Marine force pushed north toward the airfields, the 28th Marine Regiment of the 5th Division had the mission of capturing Mount Suribachi, the 550-foot volcanic cone that dominated the southern part of the island. Colonel Harry the Horse Liversidge commanded the 28th Regiment, and he knew his men had been given one of the toughest assignments on Iwo Jima. Suribachi was a fortress. The mountain was honeycombed with tunnels and fortified positions. Japanese defenders had artillery observers on the summit who could direct fire on any part of the southern beaches. Every approach to the mountain was covered by interlocking fields of fire, and the Japanese defenders had been ordered to hold Suribachi to the death. The 28th Regiment began its assault on Suribachi on D-Day, February 19th. Progress was agonizingly slow. Every yard was contested. Japanese defenders fought from concealed positions, forcing the Marines to clear each bunker and cave individually. Flamethrowers, demolitions, and grenades were used in combination to reduce each position. For 3 days, the Marines fought their way around the base of Suribachi, gradually encircling the mountain and cutting it off from reinforcements. Japanese defenders made small counterattacks at night, trying to disrupt the Marine advance, but these were beaten back. Slowly, inevitably, the Marines tightened the noose around Suribachi. By February 22nd, the 4th day of the battle, the 28th Regiment had isolated Suribachi and was prepared to assault the summit. The Japanese defenders on the mountain had been pounded by naval gunfire, airstrikes, and Marine artillery. Many of the defenders were dead. Others were trapped in the tunnels, unable to escape. But some positions were still fighting, still inflicting casualties on the Marines. On the morning of February 23rd, a patrol from Company E, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, was ordered to climb Suribachi and determine if the summit could be taken. If so, they were to raise a small American flag to signal that Suribachi had fallen. The patrol, led by First Lieutenant Harold Schreier, consisted of 40 Marines. They carried rifles, grenades, demolitions, and a small 54 by 28-inch American flag that had been brought ashore on D-Day. As they climbed the northern slope of Suribachi, Marines from other units watched anxiously, expecting Japanese fire at any moment. But no fire came. The Marines reached the summit at approximately 10:20 a.m. Finding a length of pipe, they attached the flag and raised it. Marines across the island cheered when they saw the stars and stripes flying from Suribachi's summit. Ships offshore sounded their horns. It was a moment of pure exultation, the first tangible victory on Iwo Jima. But the battle for Suribachi wasn't over. Even as the flag was being raised, Japanese defenders emerged from caves and tunnels on the summit, attempting to attack the Marines.
A brief, vicious firefight erupted. The Marines killed the Japanese attackers and secured the summit, but it was clear that even conquered Suribachi still held dangers. Later that morning, a larger flag, 96 by 56 inches, was brought up to the summit to replace the smaller flag. 6 Marines were photographed raising this second flag at approximately 1 p.m. The photographer, Joe Rosenthal of the Associated Press, captured an image that would become the most famous photograph of World War II and one of the most iconic images in American history. The 6 flag raisers were 1. Corporal Harlan Block, killed in action March 1, 1945. 2. Private First Class Rene Gagnon, survived. 3. Private First Class Ira Hayes, survived. 4. Sergeant Michael Strank, killed in action March 1, 1945. 5. Corporal Franklin Sousley, killed in action March 21, 1945. 6. Private First Class Harold Schultz, survived, originally misidentified. 3 of the 6 men in the photograph would be killed before Iwo Jima was declared secure. Of the survivors, Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian from Arizona, struggled with survivor's guilt and alcoholism for the rest of his short life, dying at the age of 32. The flag raising became an instant symbol of American determination and sacrifice. But on Iwo Jima itself, the euphoria was short-lived. Suribachi had fallen, but the battle for the island was far from over. To the north, the main body of Japanese defenders waited in their fortifications, and the worst fighting was still ahead. While Suribachi dominated the southern part of Iwo Jima, the northern two-thirds of the island presented an even more daunting challenge. This was where General Kuribayashi had concentrated the bulk of his defenses, and this was where the heaviest fighting would occur. The terrain in northern Iwo Jima was a nightmare. The volcanic rock had been twisted and fractured by ancient eruptions into a landscape of ridges, ravines, cliffs, and boulder fields. The Marines named the worst areas the Amphitheater, Turkey Knob, the Meat Grinder, Cushman's Pocket, and Hill 382, each name representing a particular piece of L. Hill 382 in the northeast part of the island was one of the strongest Japanese positions. The hill dominated the surrounding terrain and was honeycombed with tunnels and fortified positions. Japanese artillery and mortars from Hill 382 could cover most of the northern part of the island. The 4th Marine Division was given the mission of taking Hill 382, and it would take them over a week of brutal fighting to do it. The amphitheater was a natural depression surrounded by high ground, all of which was fortified by the Japanese. Marines entering the amphitheater were fired on from 3 sides. The position had to be reduced piece by piece, bunker by bunker, at terrible cost. Turkey Knob was a complex of fortified hills and ravines in the center of the island. The Japanese had created interlocking fields of fire that made any approach suicidal. Tanks couldn't maneuver in the broken terrain. Artillery was often ineffective against the deep bunkers. Only small unit tactics, squads and platoons attacking individual positions with flamethrowers and demolitions, could make any progress. The area known as the Meat Grinder was perhaps the worst of all. A complex of 3 fortified positions, the amphitheater, Turkey Knob, and Hill 382, that had to be reduced simultaneously because they supported each other with fire. The Marines attacking one position would be hit by fire from the others. The fighting in the Meat Grinder lasted for days, with casualties mounting into the hundreds. Private First Class Douglas Jacobson, a bazooka man with the 3rd Battalion, 23rd Marines, described the fighting. You'd take a position in the morning, and by afternoon the Japs would come back through the tunnels and reoccupy it. We'd have to attack the same place 2 or 3 times. Guys were getting hit all around me. I saw my best friend take a bullet in the head right next to me. You couldn't think about it. You just had to keep moving, "Keep fighting, or you'd go crazy." The Japanese defenders fought with incredible tenacity. Cut off from supply and reinforcement, running low on ammunition and water, they continued to resist. Some positions had to be bypassed because they couldn't be reduced. The Marines would seal the entrances with demolitions and move on, leaving the Japanese trapped inside to slowly die of starvation and thirst. Night on Iwo Jima brought new terrors. Japanese soldiers would infiltrate Marine lines, trying to gather intelligence, steal weapons and supplies, or simply kill Marines in their foxholes. Marine sentries had to remain alert all night, shooting at any sound or movement. The lack of sleep, combined with the constant stress of combat, wore down even the toughest Marines. Marine Corps combat correspondent Staff Sergeant David Dempsey wrote, "I've seen Marines on Tarawa, Saipan, and Guam, but I've never seen anything like Iwo Jima. These men are beyond exhaustion. They're operating on pure will. Many haven't slept more than a few hours in days. They've seen things no one should see, but they keep going. I don't know how, but they keep going."
By early March, the Marines had captured most of Iwo Jima. Both airfields were in American hands, and wounded B-29s were already making emergency landings. But the northern end of the island, where General Kuribayashi had established his final command post, still held thousands of Japanese defenders. The fighting continued with undiminished intensity. Every cave had to be cleared, every bunker had to be destroyed. The Marines developed specialized teams, demolitions experts, flamethrower operators, riflemen to provide security, and tank support when possible. They worked methodically, reducing the Japanese positions one by one. On March 9th, the 3rd Marine Division entered the line, fresh from reserve. These Marines had not yet fought on Iwo Jima, and they brought new energy to the battle. But they quickly learned what the veterans already knew. Iwo Jima gave no quarter. The 3rd Division suffered heavy casualties in its first days of combat on the island. General Kuribayashi, still alive and commanding from his command post deep in a cave system, knew the end was near. In his final message to Tokyo, sent on March 16th, he wrote, "I trust my men are fighting to the death. I will also fight to the last man." He urged the Japanese government to learn from the defense of Iwo Jima and apply those lessons to the defense of the home islands. On March 17th, American commanders declared Iwo Jima officially secured. It was a bureaucratic designation more than a tactical reality. Fighting continued across the island, and Marines were still dying. But the organized Japanese defense had collapsed. What remained were small groups of defenders, some cut off in sealed caves, others preparing for final banzai attacks. On the night of March 25th-26th, the largest of these final attacks occurred. Approximately 300 Japanese soldiers, many of them walking wounded, armed with rifles, swords, and grenades, launched a last-ditch assault on Marine positions near the northwestern part of the island. They overran 2 Marine camps, killed several dozen Americans, and destroyed equipment before being wiped out. This attack was likely ordered by Kuribayashi as a final gesture of defiance. It accomplished nothing strategically, but it demonstrated that even in defeat, the Japanese defenders would fight to the death. General Kuribayashi himself died sometime around March 26th. His body was never positively identified, though various accounts place him leading a final attack with a small group of officers. He had carried out his promise. He had made the Americans pay dearly for Iwo Jima, and he had fought to the last. By the end of March, organized resistance had ended. Small groups of Japanese holdouts continued to hide in caves for weeks, even months.
Some were killed in small firefights. Others were starved out or entombed when Marines sealed the caves with bulldozers. The last Japanese soldiers to surrender on Iwo Jima held out until 1949, 4 years after the war ended. The battle for Iwo Jima officially ended on March 26, 1945. It had lasted 36 days, more than 7 times longer than the original 5-day estimate. In that time, the fighting had been among the most intense in the history of warfare. The butcher's bill for Iwo Jima was staggering. Of the approximately 70,000 Marines who participated in the battle, 6,821 were killed and 19,217 were wounded. The casualty rate, 1 in 3, was the highest of any Marine Corps battle in World War II. Some units suffered even worse. Many rifle companies that landed at full strength on D-Day were reduced to a handful of men by the time the island was secured. Replacement troops had to be rushed in to keep units functional. Some Marines who were wounded, treated, and returned to duty were wounded again, sometimes multiple times. Of the 27 Medals of Honor awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, 22 were awarded posthumously. The recipients included Marines who threw themselves on grenades to save their comrades, who single-handedly attacked Japanese positions, who continued fighting despite terrible wounds, or who led their men with extraordinary courage under impossible conditions. The Japanese suffered near total annihilation. Of the approximately 21,000 defenders, only 216 were captured alive. The rest died in the battle or committed suicide. General Kuribayashi's prediction had come true. His men had fought to the death, taking more than 10 Americans with them per Japanese casualty. The strategic value of Iwo Jima proved real but limited. The island did serve as an emergency landing field for damaged B-29s. Over 2,200 emergency landings were made on Iwo Jima during the war, potentially saving 24,000 aircrew lives. P-51 Mustangs based on Iwo Jima did provide fighter escort for B-29 raids on Japan. But the question remains, was Iwo Jima worth the cost? Could the same strategic objectives have been achieved through other means? These questions haunted the Marine Corps leadership and continue to be debated by historians. What is not debatable is the courage of the men who fought there. Marines, Navy corpsmen, Seabees, and support personnel displayed heroism that became legendary. The battle for Iwo Jima represents the United States Marine Corps at its finest and also at its bloodiest. Admiral Chester Nimitz, in a speech dedicating the Marine Corps War Memorial, captured the essence of Iwo Jima with these words: "Among the Americans who served on Iwo Jima Island, uncommon valor was a common virtue." This is their story. This is Iwo Jima. Never forget.